In 1797, a Philadelphia physician and naturalist named Benjamin Smith Barton sat down to write a book about the origins of the native peoples of America, and in it he recorded a single strange sentence that has never been explained. He wrote that the Cherokee had told him that a certain region of their country had, in the time before them, been inhabited by another people. A people the Cherokee had found there when they arrived and had driven out. And these people, the Cherokee said, were not like them. They were pale. Their skin was white, or near to it, and they had eyes that could not bear the light of day. They were, in the phrase that came down through the record, the moon-eyed people, a people who could see in the dark of night but were blind, or nearly so, in the sun, and who therefore lived and moved and built in the darkness, and shrank from the daylight world. Barton did not invent this. He was writing down what the Cherokee had told him, or told those who told him, and what he recorded was not a monster story or a spirit tale. It was presented as history, as the sober memory of a real people who had lived in that land before the Cherokee, who looked wrong, who could not stand the sun, and who were gone, not one man's account, not a single evening story around a fire. The tradition of the moon-eyed people surfaces again and again in the early records of the southern Appalachians from more than one source, across more than one generation. The frontier soldier and statesman John Sevier, the first governor of the state of Tennessee, a man who spent his life among the Cherokee and fought them and negotiated with them, recorded that the Cherokee had a tradition of a white people who had lived in the country before them, who had built the ancient stone structures that dotted the mountains, and whom the Cherokee's ancestors had driven out after a long war. The details shift from telling to telling, the way real oral history does. But the core holds with an eerie consistency. There was a people here before us. They were pale. They could not bear the light. They built things of stone, and we drove them out. And then, as always, the account went into the books, and the books went onto the shelves, and for 200 years almost no one with the authority to take it seriously as history did. Because who takes a tribe's account of a lost pale race seriously? Who reads a story about people who could not bear daylight as anything but a fable? The record was always there, printed since 1797. Nobody with the standing to test it ever chose to look at it properly. And what the Cherokee were describing sits, to this day, on top of a set of physical objects and structures that no one has ever been able to fully explain. Objects you can go and stand in front of right now, to understand why this matters. You have to understand how specific the tradition actually was, because the details are stranger and more consistent than a mere legend has any right to be. The moon-eyed people were pale, white-skinned, in a land of brown-skinned peoples, a difference so striking that it became the first thing the Cherokee remembered about them. Their eyes were the second thing, large and light, and above all unable to function in bright sun. In the daylight they were helpless, or nearly blind, and so they were a people of the night and the shadow and the cave, active in the dark, hidden in the day. Think about what that describes. Not a spirit, not a god. A physical people with a physical trait, pale skin, light-sensitive eyes, a nocturnal life, the kind of specific, biological, almost medical detail that a culture does not usually invent when it is making up a bogeyman. Cultures invent giants and monsters and shapeshifters. They do not usually invent a shy, pale, light-eyed people with a documented, coherent, physiological reason for living in the dark. That is not the shape of a myth. That is the shape of a description. And a description is a memory of something that was seen. And here is where the tradition stops being words on a page and becomes something you can touch, because the moon-eyed people did not only leave a story. They left, the Cherokee said, their buildings. Scattered through the southern Appalachians are ancient stone structures whose origins have never been convincingly explained, and the most famous of them stands on top of a peak in northern Georgia now called, simply, Fort Mountain. There, running across the mountaintop, is a wall of stone built without mortar, stretching for something like 850 feet, in places still several feet high, curving across the ridge in a way that served no obvious defensive or agricultural purpose that anyone has ever been able to prove. Who built it? The honest answer, the answer the historians and archaeologists give when pressed, is that they do not truly know. It has been attributed to prehistoric native peoples, to Spanish explorers, to a lost colony, to legend. But no explanation has ever closed the question, and the wall simply sits there, ancient and silent, a genuine unsolved structure on a Georgia mountaintop. And the Cherokee, who lived in the shadow of that mountain for centuries, had an answer for who built it. They said they did not. They said the moon-eyed people built it, the pale people who came before, who worked in the dark, and whom their ancestors drove out? How does a people, sitting beside a wall that modern archaeology cannot explain, come to say plainly, we did not build this? The pale ones who were here before us did? Is that a fairy tale? Or is it the last surviving eyewitness testimony to who actually raised those stones? And the wall is not the only physical thing, because there is an object, a small one, ancient, carved from soft stone, that has come down through the centuries in the mountains of western North Carolina, and that sits today in a local museum in the town of Murphy. It is an effigy, a little sculpture of two figures pressed together, worn by great age. And it has a name it has carried in that region for as long as anyone can remember. It is called the Moon-Eyed People, a physical artifact, genuinely old, from the very country the Cherokee tradition names, depicting figures the local memory has always identified as the pale people who could not bear the sun. Nobody made it last year to fool tourists. It is an ancient thing, and it carries the name of the vanished people, and it sits in a glass case a short drive from Fort Mountain, and almost no one who passes it knows that it may be a portrait, in stone, of a people the entire academic world insists never existed. The story is in the books. The wall is on the mountain. The statue is in the case. 3 separate kinds of evidence, a written tradition, an unexplained structure, and a named ancient artifact, all pointing at the same vanished, pale, sunblind people. How many independent things does it take, all agreeing, before a legend has to be considered as a record? So who were they? This is where the honest investigator has to hold 2 things at once. And I want to be fair about it, because being fair is the only way this holds any weight. On the one hand, there are ordinary explanations, and they deserve to be said. The stone structures of the Appalachians could have been built by the ancestors of native peoples themselves, whose full history is more complex and more accomplished than the old textbooks allowed. The pale people could be a garbled memory of some early contact, or a symbolic story, or a tradition that grew in the telling. And the moon-eyed detail could be a description of a real human condition, of people, perhaps a small, isolated group, who carried a trait that made them pale and light-sensitive, some inherited condition of the skin, and the eyes that would leave exactly such a people, shrinking from the sun and living by night. That last possibility is the one that should make the hair rise, because it does not weaken the tradition, it confirms it. It means the Cherokee were not inventing a fantasy. They were describing, in the only language they had, a real people with a real and unusual biology, pale, light-eyed, nocturnal, the exact profile of a human population carrying a condition of light sensitivity, remembered accurately across the centuries by a people who had actually met them. They had no medical science. They had no word for the condition. And yet the people they described are a people who could genuinely have existed, whose traits map onto something real, and whom the Cherokee remembered with such specific and consistent detail that 200 years later it still lines up. They had no archaeology, and yet they told us who built the wall the archaeologists cannot explain. They had no medicine, and yet they described a people whose pale skin and failing daylight eyes match a real human condition. They had no reason to invent a shy, sunblind, structure-building race, and every reason simply to remember one they had actually driven from the land. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to keep the whole thing filed under folklore, because folklore drifts and softens and turns its people into monsters, and this tradition did the opposite. It stayed specific, stayed physical, stayed human, and stayed anchored to real stone that is still standing. So why did no one ever take it seriously? Why did the institutions that could have studied the Fort Mountain Wall down to its foundations, that could have examined the statue in the Murphy Museum, that could have treated the Cherokee tradition as a lead rather than a laugh, why did they decline? Not because they investigated and found nothing. They declined because a story about a lost pale race of sunblind builders sounded, to the educated ear, too strange and too convenient and too much like a fairy tale to be worth an honest hour of a serious person's time. And so the wall stands unexplained, and the statue sits unstudied, and the tradition stays a footnote, dismissed precisely for being the one thing it may actually be, a true account of something the rest of us find too strange to believe. So what happened to the moon-eyed people in the end? Where did the pale ones go when the Cherokee drove them out of the mountains? Some tellings say they fled west, into the country beyond, and vanished into it. Some say they were destroyed. Some say they were driven out on a night of the full moon, when the light was just bright enough to blind them and leave them helpless. But every telling agrees that they went, that a whole people, pale and shy and sunblind, who had lived in that country and raised its oldest stone, were pushed out of the daylight world and out of history, leaving behind a wall no one can explain, a statue no one can date, and a memory that the people who remembered them were finally not believed. And the Cherokee, who kept that memory for centuries, who told it to Barton in 1797, and to Xavier and to whoever else would listen, did the one thing that mattered. They remembered. They remembered a people that the science of their conquerors would spend 200 years insisting had never been there at all. And they anchored that memory to stone that is still standing on a Georgia mountaintop, waiting for someone to finally ask, honestly, who really built it? They told us there was a people here before them. They told us what those people looked like, and how they lived, and what they built, and how they were driven out. And the only reason there were pale, sunblind people in the Appalachians before the Cherokee sounds like a fairy tale, instead of an open and unanswered question, is that we decided in advance that a people without writing could not possibly be keeping a true record of a stranger world than ours. The wall is still on the mountain. The statue is still in the case. And the question the Cherokee left us, who were the moon-eyed people, and who really raised those stones, is still exactly where they left it, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a country that finally decides it wants to know. If this record moved something in you, share it with one person. Just one. The real history of this land is missing chapters, and the only way they get written is if enough of us refuse to stop asking. I'll see you in the next record. Until then, keep listening to what the elders tried to tell us.